Okay, we're going to be working on textbook 7.4 Rational Exponents. To simplify, since these bases are the same, you can add the exponents. And that makes it 10 when you're finished, because 1/2 plus 1/2 is 1. This one you can do a couple different ways. You can turn it into a radical, and then you multiply them together, it's the square root of 36. Also, you can bring them together, multiply them, because the exponent is the same. That would still be 36 to the 1/2, which turns out to be the square root of 36. So the final answer is 6. Okay, writing these in radical form, this becomes your index and this becomes your exponent inside. Or you can also write it this way. Okay, when the exponent is negative, the first thing you should do is bring down the information to the denominator, and then you write it in radical form. This is your index and this is your exponent, and you can also write it this way. Okay, with this one you would change it into a fraction first and simplify it, and then write it in radical form with the denominator is the index and the 6 is your exponent, or you can write it this way. Okay, putting them in the exponential form, you have to be careful here. This square root goes with both of them, but this 3 only goes with the x. So that's how you would write it in exponential form. This one, the square root goes with both of them, and the cube goes with both of them because it's in a parentheses. So you can write it like this, or you can distribute it and give both of them it's raised to the 3/2 power. Okay, this one, the 6 goes with all of the numbers and variables. So you could write it in exponential as 6 over 3. That's a 3, and that becomes 2. And you can also distribute it this way, which would simplify this to 25x squared, y squared. Okay, moving on. Looking at 30, you would write it x to the 2/3 power is the same as the cube root of 8, quantity squared. That would be the best way, because the cube root of 8 is 2, and then you square that, and your final answer is 4. This one, you would write the 5th root of negative 32 raised to the 6th power, because the 5th root of negative 32 is negative 2, and then you raise it to the 6th power, and because it's an even exponent and the quantity is negative, it ends up being a positive answer. Okay, with 34, the first thing you would do is move it to the denominator to make it positive. Then you would write it 5th root of 32, which is 2, raised to the 4th power, and that turns out to be 1 over 16. When you're given decimals, write them as fractions, then simplify them. Then writing it as a radical, be the square root of 16, quantity cubed, and that turns out to be 4 cubed, which is 64. Okay, with something like this, you would move this to the denominator. The 5 does not get moved because it is not being raised to the negative 1 power. With 42, you would write it, you could separate it and write it in radical form, and this becomes negative 3, and then this one has a negative exponent, so it needs to come down as a positive 3. And you either put the negative in the numerator or you write it next to the division bar. Okay, with this one you would distribute the 1/5, because this would be to the 1st power, so you multiply. And when you multiply, this would be 15 over 1. So 15 times 1, and 1 times 5 is 3. And the fifth root of negative 32 is negative 2. So that would be your final answer. With this one, you would multiply the numerator by the exponent and the denominator. So this will become negative 3/4, and this will become a positive fourth. And when you subtract your exponents, this becomes negative 1, and it would be 1 over x would be your final answer. Okay, looking at the next one. So looking at 49, you would multiply this by 15, and you would multiply this one by 15. And when you do that, this cancels out, so this becomes a 5. And then negative 2 times 5 is negative 10. And then this cancels out, this becomes negative 5. But to get the negatives positive, you have to switch them. So this goes in the numerator as a positive exponent. This goes in the denominator as a positive exponent. And that's your final answer. Okay, with 51, you're rewriting it as a radical. That would be the fifth root of negative 243, and that's negative 3, because if you multiply negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3, you would get 243. This one's a similar idea, except it's a negative exponent, so you move it in the denominator. Then you can find the cube root of negative 216, that's negative 6, and you square it, and the final answer is 36. Okay, here you're just adding the exponents because the bases are the same, and when you do that you get a common denominator, and this becomes 7 over 14, which is x over 1/2, x to the 1/2 power. And then this last one, you would subtract these exponents because they have the same base, and then you would subtract these exponents, getting a common denominator. This would become 2/4, so, and this would become common denominator would be 6, so you would convert it to 6 and 3/6. So when you bring them together, you have a negative x to the negative 1/4, y to the negative 5/6, and then you would have to move both of them down to the denominator. And that was not the last one. We've got one last one, which is a pretty long one. If you're dividing these and you're multiplying that one, then these you would subtract, and then this one you would add on, and that's the same as adding the negative 1/6. Then you have to get a common denominator, so it would be 24. And you would convert 3/4 to 18/24, 7/8 to 21/24, and 1/6 to 4/24. And when you bring them together by adding, but because they're negatives, it turns out to be a negative 7 over 24. So you would bring that down and write it in the denominator, and this would be your final answer right in here.